Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good Shabbos. So nice to be on the other side of the park every now and then to make the trek across.
In the rain.
In the rain, no less. And we've heard a few things happen here on Park Avenue and Madison Avenue, and it's really an honor to be here with you, Rabbi Cosgrove, with Rabbi Brous. And we know each other quite well, and so Sharon just leaned into me and said, it's nice to have this time, this intimate time together, yes. I'm also aware of my family here, and if my parents do show up, I think there they are, so it's an honor to speak in front of my parents and the Chvodam and my sister and brother-in-law. I couldn't help but be inspired, as I'm sure all of you who were here just 10 minutes ago, or by the stories that Rabbi Brous was inviting us into, a kind of a vision of a reappropriated and re-entered tradition. And I guess spiritual entrepreneurship, or spiritualpreneurs, whatever we might call us, to some degree, all of them are doing something that we find great leaders doing. And certainly, when we think great leaders, we think Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. And this morning's reading from Torah here and in other places invites us into a moment of Moshe's leadership, which I think is crucial in understanding, I think, some conversation about spiritual or any kind of entrepreneurship or leadership, which is that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, comes to the Jewish people and fails brutally. He has a vision of how they might be free, right? They come to bring maybe in a very banal sense, a new Ein Eloheinu, or in his case, a new vision of what they might become after 210 or 400 years of slavery, and they reject him. And his disheartened self comes back to God and complains bitterly to God. Lama re'osa lama zeh. Why did you, God, why is it your fault, right? What have you done? And God says, no, it's going to be okay, Moshe. He reassures him. And Moshe goes back to the people, and in a stunning series of verses, they reject him again. And in this rejection, the Torah then brings us into a moment that I think a lot of us can relate to. Vaydaber Moshe came el bnei Israel, and Moshe came back, Vaydaber Moshe, and he spoke Cain thus, meaning he relayed in the meaning of the context of the Torah, he gives them what God had given him, Moses. He said, I'm going to give you the message from God. They couldn't hear him. They were exasperated. They were short of breath. It literally means kotze ruach. They didn't have breath. And I remember I was on a meditation retreat a number of years ago, and it was on this week's Parsha. And in the silence of the week, I came to these verses, Vaydaber Moshe Cain, and Moshe spoke thus. And they couldn't hear him. And in my kind of contemplative awareness, I read the verse differently than I'd ever read it before. And I parsed it differently. I kind of put the comma differently. It said, Vaydaber Moshe Cain, comma, and Moshe spoke Cain, yes. Moshe spoke not thus, Cain, as meaning the words of God, but he just came with one message, which was yes, affirmation, capacity. There's a problem, and I saw it, Moshe said, and now I'm inviting all of you to trust me, as Rabbi Brous said, enough as your leader to go with it. Yes. And I think about that so often in my life, whether I'm like, tonight I'll be under the chuppah with a couple, or, in the coming weeks, whenever I'm sitting with people, the invitation always is, what might you and I, what might we say yes to in this moment when it comes to following a leader or following a direction? Having enough trust, having enough faith, having enough courage, having enough capacity to take a risk. Vaydaber Moshe Cain. The Moshe here in us, wherever it says often to us, hey, maybe give me a yes. Just go with me. And we'll see what might happen. So I just wanted to start that as a kind of way to bridge the beautiful teaching from Rabbi Brous earlier, just a couple of minutes ago, about taking a risk and maybe even failing and coming to a kiddush and having people heckle one about the Ein Eloheinu that you gave over. But it's, I think, in the spirit of yes that I think that entrepreneurs and spiritual entrepreneurs come and try to offer solutions to problems that they become aware of.
Sure. Rabbi?
Wow. It is such an honor to share this bima with three rabbis whom are my heroes. And I want to thank you for the honor of giving of your Shabbat, and Rabbi Zuckerman, your partnership in leading this community, and Rabbi Brous for all of your Torah thus far, and Rabbi Ingber, we welcome you as a friend, as a colleague, as a leader into our community, and your sister and your folks. And
my entourage.
And your entourage, right. He doesn't come alone. So, look, I framed it yesterday by way of my exchange with Susie Silverman about how this Shabbaton came about. 2020, a vision looking back, a vision looking forward. Today we're talking about entrepreneurship. And I guess I would frame it in two words, Hebrew words, azma. Kind of, so what? Or now what? 5, 6, 7, depending on how you count, years of this congregational spirit, energy, has been devoted to a once-in-a-generation building project, the fruits of which you can see on 89th Street and here in our building. And we've devoted a huge amount of time, energy, resources, and by way of a lot of hard work, we've arrived where we are right now. And the question that's being asked by the Strategic Planning Committee and by me and the leadership is, now what? Azma. For what reason have we arrived at this next chapter of our community's illustrious history? And the blessing is that we're asking this question at a moment of strength. Our congregational school is oversubscribed. Any given Shabbos, we have 2 B'nai Mitzvah in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. The Israel trip had an unprecedented number of participants. Our adult learning, the quality of our clergy, our interns, our educational staff, that which we are doing incredibly well. We're a self-reflective organization. We're stretched by way of bandwidth. There are a lot of questions we have to ask about our present mission and to make sure that we're achieving excellence in all that we are doing. But as a house of prayer, as a house of study, and a house of community, our synagogue should be rightfully proud of all that we have accomplished and all that we are accomplishing. And now let's open the next chapter. And that's why we've brought the two of you here, because you have both created from nothing with Romamu and with Ikar. You understand the soul of American Jews as received and as they are emerging, and we want to ask tough questions. And we as a community in the months and years ahead need to say, well, where are we going to place the bets right now? Do we want to create different multiple worship experiences? Do we want to rethink how congregational school looks? Rabbi Ingber has created a yeshiva in Romamu. What would it look like if the 3rd and 4th floors in our Beit Midrash were filled with Beit Midrash style learning night and day, in addition to the successes of our Melton Learning Program? What would it look like if Rabbi Zuckerman's heroic efforts in interfaith and conversion and otherwise were to be expanded beyond the envelope in which it's existing right now, or Rabbi Witkowski's study circles of bringing Torah out into the field? The hopes and dreams of Cantor Schwartz and the music team. We don't even know the platforms by which our musical vision can serve as a city on a hill for congregational music nationwide. What about the underserved communities in Hudson Yards, Battery Park, Long Island City? It is a source of great pride, but also envy to know I saw some UJA grant for Romemu, Brooklyn. And I was like, gosh darn it, why isn't there a Park Avenue Synagogue, Brooklyn? And don't answer yet.
There's a Park Avenue.
And I'm thinking to myself, well, what if Park Avenue became the place where graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary spent a few years of internship here, and we were able to seed new communities, not because we need members, we actually don't need more members, but to let the entire level of Jewish life and living grow well beyond where young Jews are moving right now. There are so many questions that we can be asking right now, and that's what the strategic planning process, this panel, is all about. You know, just to close, perhaps with the most important part, which Rabbi Brous last night was talking about, sort of the DNA, the secret sauce of Ikar, and I'm sure there are principles by which Rabbi Ingber, you operate your community and then operationalize those principles. I was thinking, what does Park Avenue Synagogue stand for? And I'll give you three. And this is what I've been thinking about, Rabbi, since your talk last night. If someone were to say, what are the operating principles, the secret sauce, the DNA of Park Avenue Synagogue? I'm going to suggest three, but I've been thinking about it only since last night. Number one, guilt doesn't sell. You cannot get people to live Jewishly by way of wagging your finger, invoking the memory of what Hitler tried to do, or the fear of anything. Our project here as a community is to create the most dynamic, engaging vision of Jewish life and living that has no guilt, that meets people where they are, and inspires them to aspire to another level of literacy, spirituality, and community connection. Which leads to principle number two, is there needs to be something aspirational about all that we do here as a community. The quality of the music, of the sermons, of the programming. It's not just excellence, but when you hear a great piece of music, when you see a beautiful piece of art, it reminds you not of the world as it is, but the world as it ought to be. You see that we're operating here, and Rabbi Ingber, as you were saying with Moshe Rabbeinu, that there's a reality that we're not yet achieving. And I think that the experiences people have at Park Avenue Synagogue should not affirm where the world is, but it should remind them where the world ought to be, in beauty and justice and in everything that we do. And the third principle, and with this I'll close, is also inspired by way of Rabbi Brous's remarks, that it happens with a belief that sanctity is achieved not just in the vertical by reaching out to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, but in the horizontal by way of a dialogic relation with another human being. A synagogue is perhaps the most countercultural institution in the landscape of America right now, because its operating principle is that of community. When people can go online in a world of disintermediation where people are not going to malls, operas, movie theaters, and otherwise, the magic of synagogue is that we still, as human beings, have a fundamental human need for social contact, for being recognized by the other. And so my belief in the power and the future of synagogue is based on my belief and trust that as much as the landscape is changing, I'm still putting my bet on the need for people to be in dialogue with another human being. These three principles, how the world ought to be was number 2, in dialogue with another person, and guilt doesn't sell. That's my read of American Jewish life and its needs, and how the synagogue plays in that playground.
Thank you, Rabbi. We have heard from Rabbi Brous about the principles of Ikar, and through a few presentations and the sort of backstory a little bit of Ikar. Rabbi Ingber, I'm wondering if you could share with us in encapsulated form, because we've got a lot to cover here. How did Romamu come about? What were the sort of guiding principles? What was your, when you sat down to write your position paper on Romamu, or your vision statement, or what did you imagine in your head that you were trying to create?
So define encapsulated, 2 minutes? Or...
Well, we're here till 6.
Okay.
And so...
3 minutes?
You take a few minutes. You take your time, but...
I can't wait to hear other people. So, Romamu was something that I didn't actually have a vision statement about. It wasn't something that I felt I had a choice. I was living on the Upper West Side. I had, I was, rabbinical school dropout, no time. My mic, that's what, so.
It's on.
No, it's off. I think I turned it off. Yeah, that's okay, that's better, there you go. So I had already been through a number of rabbinical schools. One was ultra-Orthodox, the other one was modern Orthodox. And then I'd spent about 10 years outside of the Jewish world before I tried my third rabbinical school, Yeshiva Chovei Torah. I realized I wasn't going to be Orthodox, and I was at a moment in my life where I was completely, literally wasn't sure what I was going to do next, and I met Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Alav Shalom, the founder of the Renewal Movement, that many people unfortunately have never heard of, but was maybe, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant theologians and davening masters, the master of prayer that we as Americans ever came across. He changed my life completely when I met him. It was like a chiropractic adjustment on my soul. I felt that this was the person that I'd been looking for, who had the same questions that I had had, but had sought answers and could provide insight. What's happening in prayer? What is prayer? When does prayer work? When doesn't it work? Why might it not work? All kinds of questions. He was way ahead of his time. And after meeting him and receiving smicha from him, ordination from him, I started, very similar to Ikar, I sent out an email, and about 150 people came to the first service. I had thankfully had a family that really believed in me. And I remember vividly, if you can imagine, I was 30-something years old. My parents were absolutely justifiably wondered if I would ever launch into my career. And I had a hard time moving on from experiences that I'd had that were formative for me as a religious person. And they were the ones who supported the first ever services we had that became compelling enough to make me think that something was here. Even amidst all of the synagogues on the Upper West Side, that something was happening that was a little bit different than what was happening in other places and needed, which was most important. So we started part-time in 2006, we went full-time in 2008, and now 11 years in, as you said, we have about 700 families. We started a yeshiva, we just bought our building last year, and on, so many wonderful things. And I think that what animates us, now I'm coming in for landing, I have less than a minute, is a story, another Hasidic story, that I think when I come into places like this, beautiful as they are, I always remember this story, because it animates also our new building and our structure. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, once came to a town, and because they knew who he was a master of tefillah. Imagine Ozzy coming into a small town, people say, oh, Chazan Ozzy is here, so they give him the bima, he gets up, with his gorgeous voice, he starts to sing, and then he stops in the middle. The Baal Shem Tov began and stopped, began and stopped, began and stopped, And the people were wondering what was going on. Until finally they asked, someone had the gumption to ask him. And he said, this is such a beautiful synagogue, he said, but every time I start to pray, I can't continue because all of the prayers are still stuck in this room. All the prayers of all of the past years are still stuck. He said it's a constipated synagogue. And then he quoted the Zohar. He said the Zohar says that when you pray, every prayer has to have love and awe. And those are the two wings, the Zohar says, of every prayer. They fly with love and with awe, with majesty. And so I think that for me, and it doesn't always happen, I can share also failures. It's a project, it's not an event. But I want there to be a feeling in Romamu that prayer is something that no matter how successful we are in any part of our life, there is still a deep longing, a deep yearning that we bring with us to pray. And so I once said to friends, before Romu bought Sidurim, before we bought prayer books, we bought Kleenex. Because the principle of the shul is that when people come to a place to affirm how great they are, who needs to go to pray for that? Prayer is for the rich person and the poor person, the successful, high-achieving person, and the one who never, like me, took a long time to quote-unquote launch. For every human being, no matter who they are, we all bring something that moves us to joy and moves us to tears. And a synagogue has to send that message, I said, that in this space, you can dress up, you can dress down, but make sure that we are creating a space where you can be emotionally naked, emotionally vulnerable, emotionally available. And that would be the barometer by which we judged whether or not we were doing something right. And so in a place like Rama, we cry a lot, and we sing a lot, and we laugh a lot, and we dance a lot. And so those are kind of don't have any principles other than
Bring your Kleenex.
Yeah, bring your Kleenex. And then one last thing, this is now, you said till 6, so I'm taking it, prerogative. The greatest davener that I ever met, besides my father, I loved when my father davens, but my, next greatest davener in my family was my Uncle Joey, Uncle Yasla. So my Uncle Joey passed away a couple of years ago, and he used to say that when he found out I wanted to be a rabbi, this is the joke. He always had jokes. Always. And this was the joke he said to me. He said, Dave, you want to be a rabbi now? Finally, great, it's all good. Just remember one thing. The story, he said, of Mrs. Goldberg. Mrs. Goldberg came to the rabbi in the community. She said, Rabbi, my son, it's a big problem. And so the rabbi said, what's wrong, Mrs. Goldberg? She said, my son, he went to Israel, he came back, and all he does all day is he sits, he learns, and he prays. Maybe on the 7th floor here, somewhere. He's praying, he's learning all day. And Rabbi said, well, Mr. Goldberg, that's great. That's what I do. He said, no, Rabbi, I don't know if you heard me. All day. All day, praying and learning and learning and praying and praying and learning all day. And the rabbi said, again, Ms. Goldberg, I don't see the problem. You see, I do it. Other rabbis, we all do it. She said, no, Rabbi, I get it, but he means it.
Have you guys met before with the Goldberg and the Goldberg?
So the Kleenex story is I want a shul where people come in, and no matter what they do, they mean it.
It's beautiful. Thank you. I want to give both of you an opportunity, sort of not directly in response to Rabbi Cosgrove, but sort of laying out 3 principles. Rabbi Brous, we've heard you speak passionately about justice and about compassion. And as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering sort of how does that, and Ellie, you asked this last night, I think, but not in the context of having space to expand on it. And so to the both of you, I would say, how do you actualize, the principles that are important to you as leaders, right? How do you build a community rabbis, where it's not just important to you, but there's an implied covenant between you and the community that these are principles that we all take seriously. So we talk the talk about justice, but we're also out there as a community doing it. It becomes part of the covenant, or we're serious about tefillah and about learning, but how do we sort of ingrain those qualities into our membership? So how do you take these beautiful, critical principles and turn them into really the details of what it means to be part of your respective communities?
You go first.
You go first. I've been talking all week.
I know, you've been talking all weekend. I'll give you a break. Well, let me say that from the get-go, good. Okay. So I want to disagree slightly with you, Elliot, and I want to say that it's not altogether true. I had this principle for years where I said the best have to is want to. The best have to do something is want to do something, right? We don't want our kids to be afraid. We want them to really get that brushing their teeth is a good thing. Please God, soon they'll get that. Okay, so, but it turns out that in the aftermath of Pittsburgh, Friday night at Romamu, we usually get 400 people, and on Friday night at Romamu, we had that night about 700 to 800 people, double. And the week after that, it was back to the normal. So it turns out that as much as I, as a liberal rabbi, in the marketplace of choice, where we are no longer just, we are a curation nation. We curate. People, we are all Jews by choice to some degree, and people can choose to come to hear your incredible, beautiful tefillah, or they can go to a soul cycle, and that's the reality. And the reality is that as much as I deeply, firmly believe that my job as a rabbi is to amplify the power of the Jewish tradition to the degree that someone would say, if I was going to choose on a Saturday morning to go work on my svelte, health, or I would work on my spiritual health, I can do, spiritual health in the morning, and I'll go do a soul cycle on Sunday. But the truth of the matter is I'm actually ambivalent about that project at this point. Meaning, I don't think that it's not a worthwhile endeavor. I think it's absolutely essential that because people can choose to do other things, it forces us to have music that is compelling, to have sermons that are meaningful and relevant, to provide avenues and portals for people to engage more deeply. But I'm not altogether sure that the need to survive as a people, placing that firmly in the realm of, I hope the rabbis make that compelling enough for you to choose that, it really works. So I think that every member of our community, and I'm sure yours too, is both covenanted and also curated. We want them to both feel a sense that it is in their best interest to feel the guilt of not showing up when they should show up. And that we rabbis in the liberal world should be able to say should, and not just leave it to those who can say mitzvah, 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 but yeah, mitzvah, mitzvah, mitzvah. You have a chiyuv, you have an obligation, right? What's your obligation? If you care at all about the Jewish people, and maybe you don't, we won't live unless you make the choice, even when it isn't comfortable, even when the music isn't great, even when the rabbi sermons, are not amazing and mind-blowing. But that choice that I knew as an Orthodox kid growing up, and that for the most part Orthodox people live with, most of them, that even if it isn't, you're still obligated, is something that we need to absolutely double down on, in my opinion, in the liberal world. Yeah. And we need to amplify that voice. That's the first thing, covenant. If you join the community, we expect to see you. And the hard part, of course, of the economic model is to say to somebody, just because you paid your membership doesn't mean that you're a member. And so that's a riddle on how to figure that one out.
Have you figured it out?
That's why I'm here, because I thought maybe,
No, I mean, I'm asking seriously, when you have that conversation with people who come into your office, if you have it, how does that typically go? And I know, Sharon, if I'm not mistaken, at Ikar, there is a sense of covenant that you will be taking on some sort of for lack of a better term, project or justice work. And I'm curious, how does that conversation go? And is it as simple as saying it's self-selecting? Like, meaning the people who gravitate towards social justice will find Ikar or find Romamu, and it's not really that complicated of a conversation? Or are you speaking in the language of chiyuv and of justice and of social action and of tikkun olam, et cetera, et cetera?
Sharon?
We see it, I'm sitting in between the two of you, and I think I see it a little bit like you and a little bit like you, and a little bit differently from both of you. We do use the language of chiyuv. In part of our membership application is we ask for people to make commitments in 4 different areas. One is a commitment in their own Jewish learning, which means maybe they'll learn Torah or they'll learn Haftarah, they'll learn Hebrew this year. They'll take a 6-part series with Rabbi Artson on Chassidut or something. But the idea is that everybody in the community is agreeing to take on some new learning in the year. Some kihila, some kind of community building, which means maybe hosting something in your home or coming early to set up chairs or spending 9 months preparing for a scholar in residence weekend. We have a justice piece, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, in which we really, a few people came over to me after services today and they're like, okay, I want to do something, what can we do? What can we do? And that was happening at the beginning of Ikar too. I would preach and people would say, okay, great, let's do it. And I realized we had to actually help operationalize the vision, because to put forward a vision of a truly invested, engaged Jewish community, we have to help people figure out how to do the work in a meaningful and collective way. And so we have multiple ways that people can be involved in the justice work, from direct action to advocacy, to global partnership. We have a partner community in Katira, Uganda. But we say that we expect everybody in the community to be involved in one way or the other. That does not mean that every single person aligns politically exactly and precisely. It means that everybody in the community needs to, at the very least, feed hungry people, right? At least you have to show up at PATH, which is our people assisting the homeless, and do some tutoring and do some feeding, and we are a community of activists, and some people will manifest that in going up to Sacramento and over to DC and advocating for policy change, and some people will manifest that in direct action. And the 4th is a financial commitment, which is 4th. And some people in our community give $18. We actually ask that everybody gives something, because we feel from Rambam that is a way to bestow dignity upon people, that even people who are receiving from the community collection also give to the community collection. And so we do ask for a financial contribution. But if somebody comes and says, like, I just want to give you money, but I don't really care about Jewish learning and I don't want to be involved in the community, I mean, will I take their check? It would be lovely for them to contribute to this, to the Ikar project in the world. But the people who come to us are there because they want this kind of Judaism to exist in the world, and they want to be part of it. And so we do say that this is something that's required of all people, and people will sign up and say, I will do home hosting, and then they're contacted. I'm sure you have something similar in terms of programmatics, but for us it's considered a requirement of the membership. And we say to people, this isn't for everybody. There are 100 shuls in LA. If this doesn't resonate for you, you can come to services and listen to the music and be in the mix a little bit. But when you're really staking a claim in this community, you're saying, I want to be a Jew in the world who is constantly learning and growing, who's invested in building community, and who cares about the world and is willing to do something about it. Those are basic foundational elements of membership in the community.
How do you check it?
We now have a very good team. Finally, after many years, we have a very good staff, and we don't. It's not 100%. I mean, I wish it were 100%, but we do a lot of follow-up. And part of this, we were talking last night about creating space for people to share sacred stories. But we really want to know who the people are who are coming into the community. By the way, we do something that I started to do about, 10 years ago or something, when a yard site announcement, when there's a death in the community, we'll send out a standalone email and it will tell a little bit of the story of the person who died. It's just an example, like the Yisker example that I shared last night. And I was talking to one of my friends who's from a big synagogue, and he said, I mean, ours is, by the way, we have about 800 families, households, but he's from one that's probably closer in size to your, probably twice the size, right? 1,600, I don't know how, yeah. And he said, well, we couldn't do it because we're too big. And I said, if you can't write one paragraph about a person who dies, then you don't deserve to call them a member of your community. Like, these are our people. We're in this together. This is not you're paying me so I get to give your kid a bar mitzvah. I need to know something about you. And by the way, when we do their funerals, we learn people. So up front, some of that learning, let's do it while you're still alive. And, and if not, at least we'll share then. If someone in our community's parent dies and I don't know them, I'll ask them, I'm going to put out the announcement, tell me something about your mom. Like when I called, who was she? What did she care about? Give me a picture of her. I want to see her so that I can know you by knowing her, and we can lift up her memory. And so this is one of the ways that I feel we're saying we're in a community together. We're actually it's not a utilitarian relationship. Of course, it's better when there are more people there because the davening feels better when the room is full, and we can pay our bills when people actually join and pay, and make contributions. But what we're saying is we're entering into sacred relationship with each other, and that's something that they expect of me, and I expect of them.
Rabbi Cosgrove, the little I know about your community, it sounds like it might be somewhere more on the curating end than the obligating end, right? Whereas there's not an implicit covenant, although I think we're starting to speak that language. I'm just curious if you could respond to sort of both rabbis suggesting that when people walk through the threshold of our building, that there is an implied covenant expectation of something, and how that resonates for you when you think about Park Avenue Synagogue. Right, in other words, I'll let you fix your mic. Responding to the guilt-free,
Look, I feel challenged, and the whole point of this exercise is to revisit the set of assumptions, because as we all acknowledge on some level, we're living in an age of radical choice. Whether or not people choose to identify Jewishly, never mind join a community, now's not the time for a history lesson, but Jews can go in and out of community and identity in a way that Jews have never experienced at any other point. The privilege of living as a Jew in North America today, and the challenge of living as a Jew in North America today, whether it's soul cycle versus going to services or anything. So the truth is, I'm thinking, I don't know. I'm actually intrigued. I feel like there's a world of difference between the west side and the east side of Manhattan. And someone once described the West Coast as a preview of a movie coming soon that you don't want to see. And so,
I think people might feel that way about my sermon today.
So the fact, and so I think here on the east side at Park Avenue, we are operating on a set of small c conservative principles about people self-selecting into communal life, and all the more so in a New York City where people have so many options. And so I do think, Rabbi Ingber, that there is an element of rabbinic leadership, to quote one of my favorite movies, which is, you want me on that wall, you need me on that wall, right? There is something that people come to shul for a little bit of musar, and I think of the sermon I gave on the high holidays about doing a mitzvah, actually getting in people's grill to raise the level of Jewish observance. I think that sort of leadership is the rabbinic leadership that our movement, our moment needs. I'm I'm dancing a little because I also have no idea what the implications would be, though I fear them, if I were to have on our membership form a similar covenanting set of expectations financially, justice-wise, volunteer-wise, and otherwise. And this,
Well, look,
the synagogue operates, if every member of our synagogue came every Shabbat, right?
We'd have to build a new building.
We'd have to build another new building,
Yeah.
right? So there is this unspoken understanding that the magic of Park Avenue Synagogue is a series of concentric circles. Some people are here literally every day, more than I am. Some people are here once a month, signing up for a class and otherwise. And some people who keep the lights on in this building are here twice a year. And you know what? It takes a village. And I'm grateful for all of them. So I'm challenged in this conversation.
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression, I hope I didn't give the impression that everybody in my community is absolutely always present at everything we do, and that the message, that the dance that you're trying to articulate is not just that you're challenged. I think we are all challenged. It's easy for me, obviously, to say this, and we all know that the economic model of the synagogue is such that there isn't only a covenantal, but there's a consumer element to it, obviously, and it borrows from multiple frames that are in mutual tension with one another, right? It's very rare, at least as far as I can tell, the vacuum cleaner, I think Miel or MI, whatever, how you pronounce that, they don't expect my loyalty or customer loyalty, like, where were you the last time that you bought a vacuum cleaner? Although that's what they would like to create, right? But there isn't a recognition that they're not going to guilt me into buying their product. They're going to try to think of the best way to compel me to buy their product and to clearly articulate why I should. It's in my interest to buy their project. But the covenantal, connection is a little bit different than that. I mean, my wife and I, thank God, going on, I don't know how many years now, we're still in love and it's beautiful. But I feel obligated to my wife. She doesn't have to convince me that I should continue to choose her. I made a choice, right? And that means that on really great days, I remember why I chose. It's as vivid as possible. But on really bad days, I also have to remember why I chose, because in those difficult days, that's the strength of our covenant with one another. And the same thing here. I mean, obviously, you can be a Park Avenue Synagogue and be a vital covenantal member, but like your way in might not be showing up for Friday night services. It might be to support the new yeshiva here at Park Avenue Synagogue, whatever it might be. And whoever you are, thank you for doing that. But I think that it's clear that as clergy, engagement, right, connecting with people is so vital. And I want to say the last thing about that is that what Rabbi Brous was saying was so beautiful, because there was a moment in liberal Jewish world, and maybe beyond it, but certainly in the liberal Jewish world, where we thought that the way to deepen a person's covenantal relationship was through programming. As long as we have the best programs that can compete with the JCC, or with the 92nd Street Y, or with the Romamus, or the Ikars, or whomever's, that actually is a way in. And that still is on the side of the consumer. But in the covenantal model, someone will feel more and more compelled to engage because the rabbi called to hear a story. They're not mutually exclusive, but in Ron Wolfson and other people's way of reading this moment, it's that we've weighted too heavily in the side of giving them a program versus a relationship. And if somebody calls them and says, we haven't seen you in 3 weeks, right? People leave Romamu not because we didn't give them the best scholar in residence program, but because as we grew, we didn't have the systems in place for me to remember or even notice that they weren't in shul for a month. And then they say, how important am I to your shul when you didn't even notice that I wasn't there for the past month, 2 months? So it's that kind of intimacy that builds on the covenantal side. And then you guys have such great programming, and all.
But in some ways, the programming grows out of community, right? Because we've got a learning community, we've got a minyan community. I'm looking around at see who some of the millionaires, if they're here. I mean, we have people who support. We have people who support the Minyan, talking about covenanting in different ways, who may come to Minyan every morning that we don't see on Shabbat, or we don't see in adult learning, or we see people on Shabbat that don't come to classes, or whatever that equation might be. I think the idea is to covenant to something, and it sounds like you're concretizing a system of people being involved somehow in the synagogue and making that commitment, which is beautiful.
Right. I do think that's a big part of this strategic planning project that we're doing right now. That what is a differentiated place? You have to realize how unique Park Avenue, the ecosystem of New York City is. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if LA operates the same way, but Park Avenue Synagogue exists side by side with the 92nd Street Y, with the Stryker Center, with the museums, with the opera, with the, the New York Historical Society, right? These are institutions that are all geographically and otherwise at your fingertips, all of our fingertips. So what is a differentiated role of this institution from all those other organizations that you could join? And I think that makes our project of strategic planning fundamentally different than if we were a one-horse town somewhere else. And I do come back to this question of, some of the magic has to be the virtuous cycle, that the person you see on Shabbos morning is also in a class, is also someone that you were at the same Shiva house, and is also someone that you went on an Israel trip with. That you are creating this sort of thick notion of community that, God bless, the Met Opera, but you're not going to get that in another. I don't know. I'm working on the language, but I think that's part of the differentiated role this synagogue and perhaps yours play in the lives of your membership.
I want to shift gears for a second because at some point we will start to wrap up. But I was a couple Hartman cohorts ahead of you, and in one of our sort of debriefing times, somebody made the observation that there was a time when we were growing up that you could look at the synagogue and say, in 10 years, the synagogue is going to look exactly the same, right? I mean, from the time I was 10 till the time I was 20 or 30, my synagogue in Harrisburg, well, it actually still looks the exact same. But most synagogues, you could predict what they would be doing, where would they be doing it, who would be doing it. And now we live at a time where 10 years from now, we actually have no idea what synagogues are going to be like. I mean, we couldn't predict it, for example, live streaming and the thousands of people that watch our live stream. You guys live stream, don't you? Does Ikar live stream? And we couldn't have predicted that I would be getting emails from people complaining on the live stream, right? Right? Isn't that beautiful? To talk about complaints.
Send them to
That's
Ozzy.
right, exactly. The people actually feel the love enough to take the time and send an email from the live stream. So the way, the inclusion of communities. I mean, I could go on and on about the ways in which, in 10 years from now, I don't know what we'll be discussing it. I don't know what services will look like, so I'm curious for all three of you, as you look to the future, how are your institutions, synagogues, sort of set up to address some of these? Now, I'll throw one other issue in, just the sense that contemporary Judaism is operating under different assumptions. The whole question of, for example, interfaith in the community. Right? 10, 20 years ago, we felt far differently about it. So there are a couple things to think about, but how does Romamu, Ikar, Park Avenue Synagogue start to think about not just the present and how we're best meeting the members' needs, but also the future of where we might be going or what might be happening?
I have some thoughts about that.
I'm surprised. Yeah?
So Did people read Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime? Has anyone encountered that book? So it's really great on tape. Some books are better audio, actually, because he reads it in his own voice, and it's great. He's talking about his family's home in Soweto, and he said, and the impoverished nature of his childhood and this community that he grew up in, and he says the people of Soweto had nothing, but they all had driveways built into the landscape of their home. But the strange thing was that none of them had cars because they were too poor, but they all had driveways. Why? Because one day we might make it and then we'll get a car and we need to have a place to put it. So it's great, right? It was the ultimate reflection of hope, even in the midst of this impoverishment. Who knows? Like maybe one day. So this morning when I walked out of the hotel, it was dark and ominous and I knew it was gonna rain today, but I realized I forgot my sunglasses and I thought if I go run back upstairs, there's a chance I'm gonna be late for our session, but I'm like, you know what? Grabbing the sunglasses, because you just don't know what's gonna happen by the time our afternoon sessions end. So part of what you're asking is, how do you create institutions that are nimble enough to receive whatever's coming when we have no idea what's coming? And I love even the way that you answered when Rabbi Ingber first challenged your 3 points, and you said, I'm really challenged by that. I'm thinking about it. And it's a work in progress, right? There's a kind of fluidity. And once you're building brick and mortar, it's hard to stay so fluid. And yet you are. I mean, you've just completed a massive capital campaign and this huge project in which you're making decisions about like what kind of faucets you're gonna use and what are the locks on the bathroom. And not only, how big are the spaces on the 3rd floor, and still you're thinking in this really fluid way, which I feel like that's the key. How do you hold a sense of fluidity when we have no idea what's coming? And I come from what you called last night, that wasteland, holy land, in which we are literally living on a fault line, and we feel the tremors all the time, mostly because my husband wakes me up and says, it was an earthquake, did you feel it? And I'm like, nope, I was sleeping, but now I'm awake. So that happened 2 nights ago, but we live on the fault line. But it occurs to me that we are living, all of us, in a time of tectonic shifts, and you never know what's gonna come. And when the ground rumbles, things land in different places than they started in. And how prepared are we for that kind of movement? Nobody could have predicted 5 years ago that America would be where America is today. Nobody could have predicted that we'd be heading for a 3rd election in Israel. Like, these things have never happened before, and we have no idea they were coming. And how do we adapt? How do we hold on to the kind of fluid thinking and adaptability that allows us to be able to access that? I mean, one way is to let your amazing cantors experiment a little with Adon Olam, because that reminds us that we're fluid and we're alive and things change, and sometimes there's new inspiration, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't work, but either way, it's showing us that there's vitality in this place. So I think the answer to the question is we have no idea where we'll be in 10 years. We don't know if, frankly, both of our cities will be covered in water in a few decades. I mean, we don't know. And so, I mean, we know if we don't do something serious about it now, that likelihood of that is increased. I'm sorry to scare you, but what we do know is that we have to invest in the here and now, and invest in ways that make us all the more fluid. So that great story I quoted Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Eleazar, Rabbi Shimon this morning, who went into the cave with his father. But there's a great story, I think, in Ta'anit from Rabbi Eleazar, Rabbi Shimon, and he's riding home after he's just taught Torah, and he's so brilliant, and everybody loves him, and he's on top of an animal, and an ugly man, the Talmud says, approaches him and says, Shalom, Rabi, and the rabbi says to him, is everyone in your town as ugly as you are? And it's really insulting, and the guy says, don't ask me, ask the one who created me. And Rabbi Eleazar, Rabbi Shimon realizes that he's done this terrible thing. He jumps off the animal, he begs for forgiveness, he follows him all the way back home. At the end of that story, that's where we get that saying that says, you should not be hard like a cedar, but be pliant like a reed. Because you want to be strong, and you want to put a stake in the ground, but a stake can get knocked over with the first bump. The first earthquake knocks a stake over. And a reed, it just is much more pliant. And so I think that this is about creating the space for fluidity in our thinking about the future, because we actually have no idea, and building into the system the sunglasses and the driveways and the possibility that things will come that we can't even imagine yet, but if they come, we want to be ready for them.
Thank you. Rabbi, excellent. Apropos of Rabbi Brous talking about buildings, right? I mean, Romamu you haven't moved, you have a building now? Or
Yeah.
did you move in and you're there?
Well, so we're on a campus on 105th in Amsterdam. We're in a building that houses our offices and our Hebrew school. And we also still meet in the church across the street that is now also, we're partners with them. And so between both places.
Right. So how do you stay nimble? You're not the young startup anymore.
No.
Right?
So when you ask that question, I think
I have to tell you, it gives me an incredible amount of something to like hear about your capital campaigns and your building project. Because I'm like, these startups, you know, and now they're...
At some point they become bricks
Banim
and mortar.
Gadaldi.
At some point they become bricks and mortar.
You know, Banim Gadaldi Viromamti. They became Roman. So you know, it's kind of funny because where I am now, after 13 years in this project, it's kind of amazing because Sharon and I are very close, and we work on so many things together. We're part of this thing called the Jewish Emergent Network, which is 7 communities that are startups in very different flavors, in very different ways across the country. And in many ways, all of them share some emergent quality that we're all nimble and trying new things and taking big risks. But I think for me personally, at this moment, I actually think about that Talmudic statement about being pliant. And I think that our community has been as pliant a community as you could ever find. Meaning, I'll give you an example. Years ago, it was very clear to me that we had many multi-faith communities. And so we had a couple in our community who the husband had gone to Ramaz, like I had, and met his wife at Emory University, and she was from Georgia, and she was from a very deeply Christian family. And she struggled with conversion, but eventually not only did she not convert, but she became a minister. But all 3 of their children are Jewish and go to Heschel. And they had been rejected in a number of different communities. And so they came to Romamu, and they became members of our board. And then I offered Eleanor a job. And so Reverend Eleanor Harrison Bregman is at Romamu. She's the director of Multi-Faith Initiative. She's a full clergy member. She doesn't lead davening, don't worry. But she is a full member of the community, and she meets and runs a very robust multi-faith community. And so from the get-go at Romamu, we were very clear that if you walk through the doors of our synagogue and want to pray like a Jew, sit in the pews with the Jews, that you're not actually, there's no suspicion. Actually, I feel honored and blown away by the respect you show me in the tradition by being in the presence of my ancestors. And so if you're a non-Jew in Roma, you can do anything that a Jew does. We don't divide based on Jew and non-Jew. And I actually think that is a universal ethical imperative that I find that hopefully 10 years from now becomes much more commonplace. Other things in the pliancy of Romamu and other communities like it, I think that 10 years ago when I was at Chovevei Torah, or 20 years ago at Chovevei Torah, I said, 10 years from now, everybody's going to have music. It's going to be like there are certain things that work. It's going to begin to make inroads into conservative spaces, and you have Joey Weissenberg and the beauty of his approach and the approach of Hadar. So I think that what works is coming more and more into clear sight, and that in 10 years from now, I think that questions like what works in prayer, what moves people will become more and more commonplace. And another thing I'll say is that for me, living in a polarized time now, I have to say that for me as someone who's very much a part of the liberal Jewish world, hopefully 10 years from now, the capacity of communities to hold multiple voices that disagree with one another hopefully will be stronger. And also, I think it's really important for the tension between the particular and the universal to become more and more clarified. In the sense that I think that, I'm very proud to be on a stage right here today where there's an Israeli flag, and that I think that I gave a sermon this past 2 Friday nights ago where I called upon our community to have an Israeli flag as well in our community. And I think that we must become more and more clear on the basic hanacha, like the basic things that we, as a community, we affirm, and simultaneously, and maybe paradoxically, hold a space for people in our community to disagree with those norms, but to be able to stay in the room together. To stay in the room together, right? So that that at a moment where anti-Semitism is so profoundly confusing for those of us who thought that it was, we're going to build a Judaism not from a place of guilt, not from a place of fear. We're never going to trumpet anti-Semitism as a reason to be Jewish. It's more and more important for us to actually proudly be Jewish in public. And I think more and more in spaces where anti-Zionism, which is not always anti-Semitic, but in impact often becomes that, for us to affirm our commitment to Israel and to be willing to wear that as well. And if people assume that they know what that means, we have to educate them. And if people assume that because you wear a yarmulke means that you go to prayers 3 times a day, say, listen, there's a lot of ways to wear a yarmulke and there are a lot of ways to fly a flag. But we as a community 10 years from now have to be really, really strong around principles like that, even as we fight for justice, even as we fight for equality, even as we fight for all those things. So I'm hoping that 10 years from now, those things will be absolutely clear, and that maybe we need a bit of pliancy and nimble, Cedar-like kind of combination to get there,
Rabbi, we are far from being a startup. Those years of startup are long behind us. How do we stay nimble? How do we...
So I don't know what I was hoping from this panel, but it's far exceeding my expectations, because I find myself just in your presence, Rabbi Ingber and Rabbi Brous and Rabbi Zuckerman, asking myself certain questions. And this idea that we should, and maybe I'll close by actually answering your question, Rabbi. How does one create a sense of community where we can create space for the other, a person who holds views other than us, and actually understand that as part of a beloved community? With what I was referencing earlier in the dialogue, which is that it's not the responsibility of a synagogue or any community to be all things to everyone. And all the more so, just to repeat myself, in the landscape of New York City, where I say to myself, thank God that just blocks away from here, there are fabulous options that could all be wildly successful, and there are still Jews not being served and not connected. Mm-hmm. And I celebrate the achievements of my colleagues. And so I think that a community that tries too hard to be all things at a certain point stops being a community. And so I think that's a tension that we face here in the synagogue in I think a very constructive way. And I would just conclude with both where Rabbi Ingber began, as well as the word of Torah I shared last night, which is this is a defining characteristic of Moses' ministry. That the Israelites were crushed under the thumb of Pharaoh's oppression, and it wasn't just a physical servitude, but it was a spiritual servitude, an inability to have vision as to what was beyond the horizon of their sight line. And what Moses' value added was that he inspired the Israelites to aspire beyond the reality that they knew, and he didn't get them to the promised land, but he got them out of Egypt. And I think whether it's Avraham Avinu seeing the mountain of fire when the servants at his side could only see bushes and shrubbery, or Moshe, or all the way up to Herzl anticipating the creation of the Jewish state, if you will it, this is the defining characteristic of prophetic Judaism. It's not that we are wagging our fingers at people or harbingers of doom. It's that we as a people, as a prophetic people, are able to be that reed that is able to adapt, anticipate, even beyond, or as what did Bobby Kennedy once say? It's not so much to see things the way they are and say why, but it's to see things that are not there and say why not. And a synagogue, if nothing else, needs to be a prophetic institution. And so my hope that comes out of this year of 2020, with the building, with otherwise, is that we are actively and constructively and boldly and daringly asking those questions of ourselves and our community.
Can I ask, can you have a Park Avenue, Brooklyn? I mean, I think it would be great to have a Park Avenue synagogue in Brooklyn. I think that's a great idea. How about, why not? Right. And have a yeshiva where you're training, you know, I think all of those ideas are so bold. Why not, right? Come on.
So I want to...
Maybe Ozzy can sing.
Exactly.
Can he sing his...
All right.
You can
Josh Rosenberg?
I want to tell you, Rabbi Ingber, I want to thank you for schlepping across the park.
Yes.
For sharing... For sharing your Torah, Rabbi Brous, all throughout the weekend. You have inspired and caused us to aspire, and you will continue to.